Okay, for the sake of time, I'm just going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. We're so glad that you're joining us today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Deneen Bertel, and I'm the Readiness Coordinator with the Oil Wildlife Care Network. And today we are here for the second of our 6-part lecture series. And we're really, really excited today to be bringing you an update on the Global Oiled Wildlife Response System, sometimes known as GOWRS, as well as a global perspective on a California network. Before we get into that and introducing our speakers, just a couple quick housekeeping items. Again, this is number 2 of a 6-part lecture series. We will be hosting one of these lectures each month between now and June. And if you're unable to make it, we also will be making the recordings available. So the next one will be March 9th, and that will be an overview and lessons learned from the Pipeline 00547 incident. So we hope that we see you at one or all of our upcoming lectures. And again, thank you for joining us today. Just a quick note about Zoom. I'm sure many of you are very proficient. We are in the webinar format today. So your audio settings are on the bottom, but we will unmute you if we're going to have you speak. Otherwise, you will be muted. We invite you to use the chat function, which is at the bottom of your screen. It's on the toolbar of your screen. And you can either say hello to all panelists and attendees, introduce yourself, let us know where you're coming from today or where you're at, or you can speak to each other individually. Additionally, we will be having a Q&A after our speakers today. So hopefully you can stay on, but in the meantime, please, if you have any questions, put them into the Q&A section and we will make sure that we address them either virtually or at the end of our presentations today. And if for some reason you need to leave the meeting, down on the bottom right is the leave meeting button. So if for some reason you need to sign out, please just use that button. And thank you again for being here. With that, I am going to turn it over to our director, Dr. Michael Zaccardi, to give the GOWRS update.
Actually, we're going to have Paul do his talk first, I believe. So that way I can fill in the gaps. Think of me as mortar, not necessarily the bricks. So with that, I'm going to introduce Paul Kelway. We're very happy to have him here today. We have a long history with Paul. He started out with Earthkind, with Oil Spill Response, as their development and public relations manager. The so-called Penguin and Poop Tour, as far as involvement in oil spills in South Africa, etc. Due to his success there, he moved on to the emergency relief manager at IFA in the early 2000s, where he was involved in oil spills, France, Norway, Mexico, basically all over the world. And from that, was hired and employed by International Bird Rescue and became their executive manager in the early 2010s. From that, he moved on to Sea Alarm Foundation based in Brussels, where he was senior technical advisor and actually helped to spearhead the GOWRS project that I'll be touching on later. So he was our GOWRS coordinator until he moved on to his current role with Oil Spill Response Limited, the world's largest oil spill cleanup company, and is currently as their wildlife preparedness and response manager, and is actually actively managing both the GOWRS project as it is now, as well as the Sea Alarm Foundation service level agreement for international tier 3 response. So with that, I will hand it over to Paul. Thank you so much for being here today, Paul.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. Yeah, that all takes me back. And yeah, thank you so much, Kira, Deneen, Scott, for the invitation to speak with you all today. I'm going to just check that you're seeing the right screen here. Deneen, perhaps you could just let me know.
All good.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, hello, yeah, thank you again. Yeah, Mike's obviously given an introduction, a bit of my background, and I will come back to that through the course of the presentation today. So a bit of background on this presentation. So the starting point for this was actually Oilapalooza 2021. And yeah, Kira was kind enough to reach out and invite me to give the keynote address for Oilapalooza. I asked what the themes were, and she shared that it was about being better together, reconnecting and reimagining. And originally, and you might have seen from some of the earlier promotional material that the request was for me to talk about international case studies. What could the OWCN learn from international case studies? So I thought about this, and I proposed a slightly different approach to that. And I was interested in the story of the network, of the Wildlife Care Network in California. And also how the story of the network has inspired and intermingled with developments in wildlife response elsewhere. And also to sort of mirror that back and see if there are things that the Wildlife Care Network can learn in terms of those developments that have happened elsewhere. So I proposed a slightly different take, which was to some extent a qualitative study on really the insights of and viewpoints of those questions. So that was the starting point. Then, of course, pipeline P00547 happened. I think sort of a week or two before Oilapalooza was supposed to happen in Orange County, California, as many of you know. And of course, as I think has happened before, the network was mobilized, and unfortunately, Oilapalooza had to be cancelled from last year. So it gave me a little bit more time to finish what I'd started, and yeah, get to now present this to all of you today. So as wildlife response preparedness has become more widely recognized internationally, many countries and stakeholders have really looked at the OWCN for inspiration for other national and regional approaches to preparing for and responding to wildlife emergencies. And really in this presentation, I wanted to try to reflect on some of the developments in the OWCN and the ways that the California network has inspired and influenced some of these global developments potentially, and also any insights from these efforts that could be relevant to the future development of the network and California preparedness. Mike's given a really good introduction to my background, but you know, as he said, I have been able to see and work with the OWCN from a few different angles. So with I4, obviously working with them in a partnership with International Bird Rescue to really sort of respond internationally. As Mike said, I moved to California. I worked for International Bird Rescue for a number of years, served as the executive director for a time. And I got to know the OWCN as a partner, as a responder, and also served on the OWCN advisory board for my time there. And then, yeah, from Sea Alarm in Belgium, looking at that sort of global picture and really trying to support some of this global coordination, and my current role, you know, actually working for and with the oil industry and other stakeholders for Oil Spill Response Limited. I'm based in the UK. We have bases all over the world, and you know, here I continue to try to work to better integrate wildlife preparedness and response into industry systems as well. So I do have my own perspective on the network and some of these developments, but you know, I was more interested in wanting to know what others thought, and could we actually look at this from a few different perspectives from within California and also further afield. So I decided to reach out. I reached out to a number of key stakeholders, responders, technical experts to get their take and to see, you know, what their perspectives were, how they differed, how they intersected. So as well as OWCN stakeholders from the state, from UC Davis and also some of the network partners, I also talked to people who've played key roles in developments elsewhere. So specifically New Zealand, Japan, Brazil, Europe as a whole, and the Netherlands. So in terms of California, who did I speak to? So of course, I spoke with Mike, director of the World Wildlife Care Network, Michael Zaccardi. For those that don't know him, I'm sure many on this call do. And I also spoke with Laird Henkel and Julie Yamamoto from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's OSPR, or Spill Office of Spill Prevention and Response. I also talked to some of the OWCN's network partners. So I heard from Jeff Boehm and Shelby Stout at the Marine Mammal Center. I also talked to JD Bergeron and Barbara Callahan at International Bird Rescue. And they were kind enough to speak to me, I think the day that they were mobilized for the pipeline incident. So I was grateful to get their input. And yeah, while not an exhaustive list of countries where there have been developments, I did try to get some input from across the globe. And so I spoke to Louise Chilvers at WildBase at Massey University in New Zealand. Talked to Valeria Ruopolo, who founded IUCA in Brazil. Valeria is actually currently responding to the Ventanilla spill in Peru. I reached out to Kaz Uematsu works for NRD Asia in Japan. And in Europe, I spoke to Saskia Sessions-Puplet, former colleague of mine at the Sea Alarm Foundation. For those that don't know, Sea Alarm is based in Brussels and have really been a major catalyst for developments in wildlife preparedness and response in Europe, but also internationally. And I spoke to Saskia specifically about EUROA, which is a European network of wildlife responders that has formalized in recent years. And last but not least, I spoke to Simona J, who's the coordinator of the Dutch National Network of Wildlife Responders, which is called SON Response. So in the end, I amassed quite a bit of information from talking to some really experienced people who have a lot of insights and knowledge of the field. For those that don't know, just thought it was worth just quickly saying what the World Wildlife Care Network is. This might be a moot point for most of you here, but for over 2 decades, it's really served as an example of what's possible in terms of wildlife preparedness, bringing together these key elements of academic rigor, programmatic funding, multi-stakeholder partnering. It's a statewide collective, so there's trained wildlife care providers, regulatory agencies, academic institutions, and wildlife organizations. Founded in '94 and established as a partnership with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Office of Spill Prevention and Response, which was established after the Exxon Valdez spill. It's a key program of the Karen C. Dreyer Wildlife Health Center at UC Davis, from where the network's managed. Today, there's inland and marine capabilities, 40 member organizations, more than 1,300 trained responders and specialized equipment and facilities. So I think it's fair to say in terms of wildlife response that California is really one of the most prepared regions in the world. In speaking with all the California stakeholders, there was a few key milestones that came up when I asked that question. So I think a starting point, of course, is the Exxon Valdez spill, which of course led to major changes in the preparedness and response approach in the US, but also the American Trader spill, which was closer to home in Huntington Beach. And that was really what led to the Lempert-Keene Sea Strand Act coming into place in California, which established OSPR, the Office of Spill Prevention and Response, in the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and gave them the authority to direct all spill prevention and response efforts and restoration. And that act required OSPR to establish rescue and rehabilitation stations, and led to the creation of the World Wildlife Care Network in '94. So it's significant because it really provided a very clear mandate for the integration of wildlife response within that wider OSPR response context, which I think is absolutely key. 97 was the opening of some of the first facilities. I think the 2 facilities there that first opened were Santa Cruz and SeaWorld. And 97 also brought 3 major spills with it as well. Mike shared with me that it was almost every time that a center was opened or facility was opened, there was a major spill. And Barbara recounted, I think at the time, International Bird Rescue were dealing with a 600 grebe spill in Santa Cruz, one of those incidents. And then they headed up to Northern California for one of those other incidents that had occurred. And John Mazet, the former director of the OWCN, was already there and actually had arrived by helicopter And Barbara recalls thinking, wow, you know, we've really got some infrastructure now. So I think, again, it just speaks to that, you know, sort of added impetus and that sort of added resource structure that the network brought. In 2000, of course, the opening of the first brick and mortar, well, I was sorry, the primary care facilities happened. So that was in Cordelia for the San Francisco Bay Center and San Pedro for the LA County, Southern California Center. You know, it was always recognized that International Bird Rescue would inhabit those facilities, given their sort of history in the state and expertise, and were very involved in the design of those facilities as well. And they, of course, moved from their sort of home base in Berkeley, California, to run their year-round aquatic bird rehab program from these new facilities. So they not only moved to Cordelia, but they also expanded and moved south to run the LA facility. 2000 was a very interesting year because it also coincided with some really significant international spills that International Bird Rescue were involved in. And it was really when that partnership with IFOR was really expanding and becoming established. So probably the most notable there is the treasure spill with these 20,000 old penguins, which really brought together a lot of the international community. And again, Barbara recounted being in South Africa with Jay Holcomb at the time and having daily calls back to California, sort of dealing with and preparing for the opening of Cordelia. So really a pivotal year in many ways. Costco Busan response in 2007 certainly came up. I think, you know, the paradox in a way, as Mike called it, of being actually sort of the most prepared the network had been, but having this public perception as people looked at oil on beaches and essentially wanted to see more happening, that the feeling was that there wasn't enough going on. And you know, the irony really that it was the first spill where there wasn't a need to have volunteers, sort of spontaneous volunteers because of the number of trained individuals, but actually everybody wanted to help. So, you know, that really led to the founding of the US Spontaneous Volunteer Program, as well as really recognizing the importance of proactive public communications when it comes to wildlife efforts, and especially, you know, with the advance of social media as well. It also brought with it very much this recognition of the need to deploy early and brought about those changes to how the OWCN approaches the field response side of things, and really led to the expansion of that field program. Macondo, or Deepwater Horizon, was certainly key because of the well, the scale of that, and really it was the first time that the OWCN were asked to lead outside of California, and so Mike was brought in to work for NOAA to oversee specifically the sea turtle and marine mammal response during the Deepwater Horizon Macondo spill. And I think that very much led to OWCN considering ways that they could assist more broadly, whether that was in the US or globally. In 2014, of course, the expansion of the OWCN's mandate to also include inland response to inland waters. And as Mike said to me, it's literally a whole different beast. The stakeholders, the species, and in many ways, it's been a repeat of the 90s, where it's this sense of starting a new program and having spills that coincide with that expansion. And the last one I've got here, because I don't have the spill that happened last year, because that was going on when we were pulling this together, was the Refugio spill, which happened in Santa Barbara in 2015. And a few people said to me that, you know, really this was the first of very much this new kind of response. There was automation, there was use of technology, there was webinars for training, there was the field sort of recovery app. And there was this expanded team at UC Davis. So there was more work being done internally. And the Marine Mammal Center mentioned that was a spill that really helped them with identifying specific roles and really understanding how best to support the team in a response. Although it is fair to say, I think that these represent some of the key milestones. I think it is also really important to remember that World Wildlife Response had been happening in California for many years previously. And of course, International Bird Rescue was founded in 1971 after the collision of two tankers in San Francisco Bay. And that really sparked a community-led and somewhat chaotic response effort to that spill and led to the establishing of International Bird Rescue in Berkeley. And the Marine Mammal Center was founded shortly after that in 1975, amongst many other organizations that were forming. And the late, great Jay Holcomb, former director of International Bird Rescue, he saw the need and the benefit of a more formal network in California. And as Barbara recalled to me, if you had asked Jay, he would very much say it was his idea. And I think certainly he and Dave Jessup, former wildlife veterinarian with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, were certainly very instrumental in those efforts. And JD recounted to me how Jay and another bird rescue alumni, Mimi Wood Harris, actually regularly visited Sacramento during that time to really lobby for those legislative changes that came about in 1990. So again, it's just this wider context of the sort of building on the efforts of the rehabilitation community and bringing more sort of structure and mandate and funding to that. I asked everybody in California what they thought were the key strengths of the network. And again, there was a few themes that came up here. I think, sort of all of them are very understandable. Science driven, I think, was the first and most common theme that came up. This sense that it's all about up-to-date science, best achievable care, bringing veterinary science to wildlife response and initiating really one of the only research grant programs that's dedicated to the field. JD had commented that plugging into a major university really raised the profile in a way that would have taken smaller nonprofits like International Bird Rescue a lot longer. So, real recognition for that. The collaboration, of course, it is a network, and that spirit of collaboration is at its heart. And, Mike talked about weaving together these different skill sets to allow organizations to participate and offer their abilities, to contribute to the whole. And obviously over time, that's become more diverse, and the OWCN has really democratized wildlife response. So there's really been this concept of mutual aid as well, and that's been about also bringing groups from outside California when needed, and also offering support to other groups as well. And I think if we think about International Bird Rescue's international profile, especially built over those days working with I4, it also meant that they were meeting many people on spills around the world, and those people wanted to come and visit these new purpose-built facilities. And Barbara shared about hosting these delegations in those early days from Brazil and the Netherlands, Belgium, Russia, and China. On top of that, they also had an internship program that would allow those folks to come and stay and work at one of the facilities and really gain more expertise. And often those people were then inspired to take those ideas back and try to implement change in their own countries and possibly actually look to build new facilities. And as well as that collaboration, of course, the coordination, that the other thing that was noted is that, having that coordination body, obviously the management that happens at the Wildlife Health Center, being that interface with government network members and other stakeholders has also been really key. And Mike Zaccardi was mentioned specifically by a few people, and acknowledging his years of service as the director and providing that consistency and continuity and really helping to create that standardization across all the processes and systems. And last, and again certainly not least, is the funding, the integration, and that legislative mandate. So really the existence and funding of OSPR is key. That was certainly mentioned. And the fact that there's this agreement that OSPR will take the lead on wildlife response, enables that integration. And certainly in terms of the operations at sea or shoreline, all of that is able to come together. And importantly, because OWCN has learned the language of the incident command system, that, as Julie had commented, is really sort of what's allowed that marriage to work. That common language and that approach ensures that the integration with the wider OSPR response can take place. And ultimately, the existence of that legislative mandate, is absolutely key, because it provides that clarity to all stakeholders, including the oil industry. And Julie also shared with me that California has this great, very specific law, and that backs us up, and industry really has had to come along with that, and over time they've really benefited from the training and the planning that they're required to do. And actually, in many ways, the OWCN gives them like that public cover that the OWCN is perceived favorably. It's seen as having competent responders and a professional approach toward wildlife. So it's something that I think industry have seen the benefits and have been strong supporters of it. Any network, of course, is constantly evolving. So yeah, it's only natural that challenges exist, and these very much provide the signposts for future learning and improvement over time. And so just a few themes that came up were, well, one, the challenge of having a best achievable care approach, never feeling that you're ready enough, constantly striving. And as Mike said, you never really know if you're ready until it happens. So, that's made the network very dynamic, but also perhaps a somewhat challenging place to work, and like always trying to improve and be better. The limited number of spills, I think, as the sort of number and type of spills have changed, I think that the recognition that it's been difficult for people to get the experience that they need, and the challenge, certainly as the network has grown, that you've got more trained people, and they expect to be involved. And if they're not engaged and responding, how to keep their interest and keep their skills up as well. The global profile, there was a reference to just the fact that, really trying to balance the state responsibilities with that sort of growing global profile and sort of work nationally and internationally. Certainly, one that's, continues to, be an area of focus. And I think International Bird Rescue, I think it's fair to say, have perhaps a unique perspective on the network, because they, inhabit and manage these primary care facilities. And I think they'd be the first to say that they've both gained much, and in certain aspects of their work, they've lost other things. And I think it's something as part of their growth. I mean, certainly their rehabilitation program and the scope of their work has grown. But obviously with the network coming online, they saw their response retainer contracts come to an end with industry. So, they were no longer needed in terms of retaining services, and obviously they've had to adapt to that. I think also in terms of the facilities, I think we're now 15 years on or more. Quite a few years or more on than that, but these facilities are starting to show their age a little bit, and more funding is needed just to undertake some of those needed upgrades. And there were obviously some sacrifices that had to be made in terms of the location of the facility too, especially due to property prices in the Bay Area. The chosen location in the end for the Northern California San Francisco Bay facility, it's quite a distance from the ocean. So not only has that created some transportation issues, but the Sassoon Marsh also brings with it risks like avian malaria and also the possible risk of flooding. So again, these are things of just sort of growing and learning as the network continues to develop. At the heart of any network, of course, is the desire to collaborate, and talking about just some of the learnings and challenges with this. A few things came up, and I think one of them was just balancing the network versus the member organization identity. How to make sure that there's enough credit for the individual contributions and enough funding for those individual members, but also that recognition of the network as a whole. And Mike talked about that sort of need to really be clear in the communications around the network. Of course, that the team at UC Davis is very much the management team of that network, and the OWCN itself is that collective of all those different entities that make it up. So really communicating that clearly. Government and industry participation. So having an advisory board that can tap into those stakeholders, has really been seen as extremely valuable. Laird commented that this system has allowed those stakeholders to see each other as collaborators, not enemies, and in turn it's helped industry willingness in terms of being comfortable turning over the reins in a response, and they really see the network as approaching wildlife response in a professional manner. Democratization of response. So this increase in diversity and size, but also that some of the maybe challenges that's brought, where people are trained, they have the feeling that they're going to be called, there is an expectation that they're going to respond, and how do you do that when you've got 1,300 or more trained responders? And also the message in a way that anybody can be trained to respond, but the question is also, should everyone? Does everybody have, what it takes? And obviously, when you have an incident, you want to make sure you have people not only have the expertise and the experience, but also, understand that perhaps the emotional toll that the wildlife response can take. And lastly, decision making. I think, while the network has democratized response, it also perhaps hasn't necessarily incorporated that democracy into its governance and decision making, or that was the perception in some of the conversations I had. So, while working groups have been developed to get member participation in change initiatives, there's perhaps still a need for network members to have a stronger voice and explore ways to do that. And JD shared that the OWCN is democratized on an individual level, but perhaps there's a missing piece there, which is the Congress or House of Representatives, as it were, but a body that can really work out some of the gnarly issues between members, and it all comes up as part of collaboration. So a few really good takeaways and learnings there. And in particular, looking at response, I wanted to ask what some of the notable changes were that people felt over those years. And a few really interesting things came up here. And I think one that I've touched on already is this sense, as Mike called it, front loading to the field in response. So, learning those lessons, not just in terms of public perception and sort of public safety, but also in terms of what's best for the animals. So, providing that immediate care via field stabilization, which has increased survival, and also that added impetus and focus on reconnaissance and hazing and deterrence. Embracing of technology, so the wildlife recovery app, the use of the OWRM database in terms of sort of electronic records, the use of drones in the fields, electronic notification and activation, all these things have come into being. And it was mentioned about the training being standardized over time and also being complemented by specific tailgate trainings and adaptations for response when needed as well. And the increased size of that management team, the fact that you have more staff at UC Davis managing these key areas of response. So that was a summary really of just some of the findings and some of the takeaways from some of the California stakeholders. And yeah, just to touch on the different international stakeholders that I spoke to, and a few key themes that came up there. So looking at New Zealand, the interesting thing there, of course, is that it's also about the involvement of a leading veterinary science institution, so Massey University in this case, and they have a formal role to play in wildlife preparedness and response in New Zealand. Not as many staff and trained people, so there's 12 personnel at Wild Base at Massey University, and they have about 50 trained people. But Massey hold that contract for the New Zealand government under Maritime New Zealand, and essentially have responsibility for everything to do with wildlife response. Interestingly, it wasn't triggered by a spill at home. It was actually the Exxon Valdez that really had New Zealand really thinking about the need to be proactive in their preparedness. I think very much seeing themselves as a very similar country to the US. And I think ultimately the Rena spill, which happened in 2011, was the real clincher in terms of the way the public and the media really sort of perceived wildlife response and really see it as an important issue. And ultimately, I think it fits in well, as Louise said, with New Zealand culture, where there is this strong recognition and protection for wildlife and wildlife habitat. So there's this great strength of communication there between the university and the government, similar to in California. It's very well integrated international exercises. Louise talked about the fact that the government actually has a KPI, a key performance indicator for the inclusion of wildlife in exercises. And the government, I think, is always very complimentary about the professionalism of the wildlife response. There have been challenges, and I think that Louise mentioned that during some of the debriefs from the Rena spill, there was some recognition that Massey was seen as very good at managing animals, but perhaps less so at managing people. So they've had to put a lot more effort into people management, emotional compassion fatigue, and other aspects going forward. And in terms of their links to the OWCN, well, it is a different model. It's not a network of organizations in the same way, but very much modeled on the processes and procedures from California. And as Louise said, OWCN are very much seen as the leaders, and Mike specifically has been a fantastic mentor to the team there. So they look to that system, and I think they immediately look to responders from that system, because they know if they need help that those responders already work with the same kinds of structures and systems. And certainly there were teams from International Bird Rescue and World Wildlife Care Network that responded to the Rena spill there in 2011. More recently, there was a joint online training program that was developed actually between UC Davis and Massey. So there's another linkage there. And in terms of their incident management structure, so during the Rena, World Wildlife Response was actually a sixth cell in their SIMS system. But that's actually recently changed. And so now wildlife is actually integrated across all IMS functions, which is really interesting. And there's more of a focus, I think, on primary and secondary SAT strategies, so sort of keeping animals away from oil. And they've really evolved, and I think recently moved from a series of regional teams to one national team. So yeah, that is New Zealand, and certainly some of the linkage between New Zealand and California. With Brazil, huge developments over the last 20 years, also triggered by a spill 20 years ago or more in Guanabara Bay. And that was really the first time that the university there was asked to respond to a spill by Petrobras. And subsequently to that, Valeria Ruopolo, who now runs IUCA, was actually funded to go to the International Effects of Oil on Wildlife Conference. And so she met Jay, she met Scott Newman and Mike Zuccardi from the World Wildlife Care Network. And then she undertook a visit afterwards to International Bird Rescue and to see the facilities, and spend time with Jay and Dave Jessup and John Mazet, and really sort of took some of that home to Brazil in terms of how could we emulate this. And over time, connected to that Guanabara Bay spill, legislation did change in Brazil. And IUCA was actually founded in 2010. And it was after a spill in 2011 that wildlife response actually became a requirement in Brazil under sort of national legislation. And specifically, it applied to spills where there was a responsible party. But the government essentially required this, and in particular, IBAMA, which is the government authority in this case, specifically required Petrobras, who really have about 90% of the production of oil in Brazil, to fund the development of an World Wildlife Care Network. So that was actually developed and connected to an World Wildlife Response Plan in 2016. And Valeria shared that the legislation has really helped a lot. And I think without that, without Obama sort of pushing that, probably it would not have happened on the scale that it has. And it's certainly been seen very favorably by international oil companies. But it's different from California in the sense that the government funding isn't there. So there's a system and a network, but it's very much based on market forces. And that's been a sort of blessing and a curse in a way, that it's created a whole industry. And I think different groups are in it for different reasons. There's a lot of competition. And again, I think a lot of people thinking they can do wildlife response and trying to sell their services. So that has certainly brought some challenges with it. But there's been a lot of influences, I think, from California. Certainly, as I said, the visit that Valeria had there, the support that she had from Bird Rescue and I4 in developing a penguin network of responders across South America. And that was ultimately a model that the Brazil network was based on. And I know she's brought in the World Wildlife Care Network to work on projects there, including implementing an IMS system with a project to protect the La Plata dolphin, and also bringing Kira and Kurt down to Brazil to help with some of the offshore strategies around hazing and recovery. So an interesting case study, and one where there's been incredible change over the last 20 years. In Japan, perhaps less so. So also triggered by a major spill in '97, the Nahodka spill, which happened there. And actually Kurt Klumpner, who was working with Bird Rescue at the time, was actually responded to that spill and supported the local efforts. And that really led to some changes in domestic legislation, involvement of veterinarians in the national plan. And the natural resource damage assessment process being implemented after that spill. It also led to the development of a national training facility for waterfowl rehabilitation built in Tokyo. And over the years, I4 and International Bird Rescue have supported trainings that have happened there, and there's continues to be an annual training event for local government employees. There was a recent spill there, the Crimson Polaris spill, and Kaz Uematsu, who's a veterinarian based in Japan, conducted some NRDA in relation to that spill, and is still very actively involved. And in terms of other linkage to California, there was a symposium that they organized after that Nahodka spill and invited California stakeholders to present on wildlife preparedness and response. And that was very much the prompt for some of that the waterfowl rescue facility, and also the increased efforts to integrate and plan. And since then, and you can see the T-shirt, Kaz has stayed very well connected to International Bird Rescue. In fact, his daughter also attended an international internship with Bird Rescue as well. So he continues to fly the flag. But I think, as Kaz shared with me, since Nahodka, the number of rehabbers and vets who've actually experienced an incident is seriously decreasing. And I think his desire for the future is to see Japan actively leading to support the younger generation sort of coming in and participating in response and gaining experience before that a current cohort of people who experienced the Nahodka retire and are no longer around. So an interesting case study there as well. And finally, moving into Europe, speaking with Saskia, of course, bigger developments in Europe, these major spills in the early 90s that really sort of triggered the fact that national authorities, had no strategy, and that wildlife response wasn't integrated. And so since that time, wildlife responders really worked together to keep the conversation going. And Sea Alarm itself was founded in '99, and it was born out of the rehab community as really an effort to bring that community together, to achieve more formal recognition and also integration with government and industry. So there was efforts to build that community in Europe under the EUROA network, and of course globally under GOWRS. EUROA has actually been funded by the European Union for 2 projects, so that's actually allowed more formal cooperation, and through that EUROA has developed its own training courses and supported more consistent response and animal care standards. And now in this follow-up project, there's more engagement with regional and national authorities in Europe, and EUROA now has this formal right to speak to authorities via some of these regional agreements. So it's a unique case study, I think, because of the fact that EUROA obviously is representing different countries, not just different states. So in that sense, it's it's an ambitious project. It's not necessarily followed the structure of the World Wildlife Care Network, but certainly the European protocols are very influenced by the US protocols that were developed through EOW conferences, spills, some of the members of EUROA visiting the California facilities, etc. And Mike, in fact, served on Sea Alarm's board for a number of years as well. But the funding, I think, has been more of a challenge. There isn't that sustainable funding as there is in California. So there's been a lot of sweat equity from Sea Alarm. And as Saskia said, EUROA is operating on a fraction really of the budget in California. You also don't have that ICS structure as a sort of unifying force. In Europe, it's much more fragmented. So that's led to also a disconnect between the at-sea responsibilities and shoreline. So that's something that Sea Alarm are trying to help address. And there hasn't been that legislative change. So the focus in Europe has been more on the operational side of response rather than that sort of legislation. But ultimately, as Saskia said, wildlife responders in general really are the backbone of any big incident. And so much of what Sea Alarm does is sort of respecting and recognizing that and really bringing those folks together and really trying to get that support and integration and recognition. And importantly, a good example of that integration was a spill that happened in 2018, which was the Boja Bile spill in the Netherlands. And that was really a moment to bring together national responders in the Netherlands with the European network, and also some representatives from the global network of GOWRS as well. Conscious of the time here, I'm trying to just quickly wrap up here. Last country just to mention is the Netherlands. I talked to Simona J. Sea Alarm have also been an important catalyst here. In fact, Sea Alarm were founded in the Netherlands, although they ended up moving to Belgium. But there's been efforts really there for the wildlife response community to come together and also to get more sort of government recognition. So things have really taken off since 2009, when there was a first wildlife response plan and recognition and funding from Rijkswaterstaat, which is the Directorate General for Public Works and Water Management in the Netherlands. So they have a statutory role in pollution incidents at sea. But in the Netherlands, as in many countries, I think the government responsibilities can be quite fragmented between national and local and different topics. And I think that so often the case is different stakeholders and parts of government are looking at each other and expecting that the responsibilities fall elsewhere. And what Rijkswaterstaat did was essentially sort of take on the responsibility for wildlife response underneath their other sort of responsibilities. So they sort of did that from a point of view of trying to support greater clarity, and since then, through a program that they funded, CLM have helped to support and build this in-country network, which is now called SON Response, to really serve as an umbrella organization, similar to how the World Wildlife Care Network does, to be an interface between wildlife responders and the government. It's not that army of trained responders, Simona said, as in California, but they've now defined roles and they're really training according to those EUROA standards. But there hasn't been that legislative change. And I think there's this perception that Rijkswaterstaat are always the entity that's responsible, and that's not the case currently. So a couple of important things to keep in mind there. And of course, that Bojabile spill I mentioned, which had about 500 oiled swans, which was really a test case in a way, very successful response, but really brought together, all these different levels of cooperation and a lot of lessons learned and stuff implemented since that incident. So just coming back to the end here and really recognizing across California and the other stakeholders I talked about, just some of the themes that were mentioned as recurring challenges and barriers to future response. Funding, of course, recognizing that good readiness costs money, recognizing that oil disasters are changing, and there's other non-oil related emergencies that brought about through climate change and other means. And the question is, how can the WCN and other stakeholders respond to that? Jeff Boehm at the Marine Mammal Center mentioned the idea of taking the O off the front, thinking more from a point of view of wildlife care, not necessarily just when it's oil, and how can we prepare for those kinds of instances. Political challenges, of course, are always going to be an issue, competing priorities, getting in the way of technical know-how, and of course, where the responsibilities for oiled wildlife remain unclear. And of course, just the frequency of spills, as Mike shared, they're seeing smaller but more frequent incidents, and the challenges that they bring, such as inland response and the very different stakeholders that have to be engaged with there. And I think a final important shared challenge is this generation change that's underway in the oiled wildlife response community. It was mentioned by many, many people, and there's that risk of brain drain in the field, and it really highlights the need for succession planning. And JD had shared that, there are the people who have done 40, 30, or even 10 spills will be very minimal. And that question of how do we create that next generation? And of course, COVID-19 has not helped, in terms of getting together and doing trainings. So in conclusion, I think it's fair to say that the Old Wildlife Care Network and its founding members, have really advanced the field tremendously, have really shown what's possible when funding, legislative change, multi-stakeholder collaboration, and a commitment to excellence come together. Without any one of these elements, I think its impact would be diminished. And I think we've seen that in other parts of the world where there's been tremendous change, but often there is a missing ingredient, and often that can be funding or that legislative mandate. But I think the common thread through all of this, from what I heard and what I've seen, is that it's all about people with a passion for caring for wild animals. And as Mike said, only so many people are crazy enough to dedicate their life to this. And I think it's through their efforts and it's through major oil incidents that government and industry have been encouraged to step up. And often it's been individuals in those stakeholders that have helped to bring about those changes as well. But I think while every spill is a local spill and a local issue, I think it's also clear that there's a real interconnectedness within that international community of responders. And I think there's a willingness really to learn and work together that's really spanned decades. And I think that next investment now is that consistency in terms of investment and standards across the whole world, and really ensuring that these systems are well connected. And hopefully in that way, the knowledge can be sustained for future generations. And I think that's why things like the Global Old Wildlife Response System Initiative, are really important. So, as we transition our energy use, I think the threats to wildlife will remain, and that way we can continue to reach out beyond our borders, work together on the future challenges that we're all going to face. So, bringing it back to the theme of Oilapalooza from last year, I think it's fair to say that whether it's California or if we're looking at the whole globe, we're most definitely better and stronger together. And I think the message is really, let's stay connected and let's keep imagining a more prepared world for wildlife emergencies in the future. Thank you so much. And my apologies also to Mike for me running over my time quite significantly, but thank you so much for the time and to everybody that spoke to me in this project. Thank you for the invitation for everybody for listening.
Great. Thanks so much, Paul. Wonderful presentation, and I absolutely pleased to decrease the amount of time I have for the completeness of yours. So thank you for all of that. I'm going to roll into my presentation and just confirming you can see the correct slide going.
Looks great.
Great, thank you. So Paul mentioned it several times as far as the Global Wildlife Response System. I'm just going to give a brief slide deck as to what this actually is, and we'll give a longer talk later related to GOWRS itself. So real briefly, as Paul mentioned, there has been a mixed history of success for international collaborations similar to what we've developed here in California, one of which was the International Alliance of Oil Wildlife Responders, which was a picture Paul had in his slide deck with many of us looking much, much younger than we do now. But really the core thing that happened that really fomented what became the GOWRS project is Deepwater Horizon, or Macondo, in 2010. Industry developed a joint industry project which really focused in on 19 different key elements to try to standardize international response, one of which was oil wildlife response. For the first time, it was seen as a core component of spill preparedness and response. And so that led to what became the GOWRS project, Global Oil Wildlife Response System project, funded in 2015 as one of those joint industry projects, really with the intent to create an international framework for Tier 3 response. So you think Tier 1 is local, Tier 2 is regional or national, and Tier 3 is international response. And really what we're focused in on is that international large-scale efforts. And so really developing the systems to allow for that international level response, but also to assist industry in developing Tier 1 and Tier 2 capabilities. So between the years 2015 and 2021, we had a large number of project outputs. We developed internationally agreed upon animal care standards, standard operating procedures for response, roles and responsibilities and training requirements for that, equipment and supplies, and then guidance material for industry. However, in doing that, that was developing the backbone of what is needed. What actually industry was calling on is the ability to activate a single body to assist in some of these Tier 3 responses. So in the past year or so, we have developed the Global Oil Wildlife Response System to the Global Oil Wildlife Response Service. And what that is it's a guaranteed 4-person team that can go into these Tier 3 responses, do an assessment to see whether or not a full-scale response is necessary, and to provide that information to the spiller. Those individuals would also become the first group of individuals that could be there to do that operational response. And that is a project that has been agreed upon and is being funded directly by OSRL, Oil Spill Response Limited, under Paul's supervision within that. So really what this 4-person assessment team is designed to do, it's 4 key elements: wildlife ops and planning specialist, which is somebody that's going to be at the incident command post, working directly kind of at that upper level incident management system. We have a field and a capture specialist and a rehab and facility specialist that would actually go out and do the assessments to see what the capabilities are, what the needs are. And then a 4th person of the team, which is going to be incident specific, or a veterinarian if a vet is not included in one of the other 3 components, because a spill in the Arctic versus the equator, it's going to have very different elements within that. So we wanted to have a 4th person to ensure that we have the capabilities for it. Now, currently, the 10 organizations that are part of the GOWRS service is the 10 on the screen, including the Oil Wildlife Care Net, but also including International Bird Rescue, Focus Wildlife, and Tri-State Bird Rescue in the US. All 10 of these organizations working cooperatively to make sure that not only is the service capabilities occurring as far as assessment teams going out, but also the infrastructure that is needed for that. Ongoing training, ongoing preparedness is able to happen during non-spill time, so we can continue to build and increase the capabilities within the GOWRS team. So since 2015, we've developed these standards. All 10 organizations have worked very closely together, and we actually have a real much better shared knowledge and understanding of what each of the organizations can do. And what we're looking forward to right now is really fully operationalize that Tier 3 assessment service, but then also moving forward, building out the capabilities of moving to an operational response if and when it's necessary. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Kira.
Okay, thank you, Mike, and thank you, Paul. Excellent presentations, and we are running a little bit behind, but Paul has agreed to stay on to answer any questions that anyone might have. So if you have a question, you can either raise your hand or you can type it in the Q&A, either one. Okay, maybe I'll start us off. So Paul, my question for you is, was there anything in all these interviews, these wonderful interviews that you did, is there anything that really surprised you?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Kira. I'm just trying to think. I mean, I don't think anything really surprised me. I think, you know, I'm always fascinated by just these individuals that have really just stayed the course, you know, and I think they sort of got the bug. They really feel like they want to make a difference. And, you know, sometimes that traction has happened, and sometimes it's very slow progress. And I think for me, it's just appreciating how much, you know, you need those individuals to really help to drive that change. So not so much surprising, but something that came up that I really admire and, you know, and appreciate. And I think, again, just the interconnectedness of, I thought about trying to almost like draw the lines between all these different people and all these different entities, and it would be a very messy picture because they've met in so many different ways and facets, and I think that is just so interesting in itself. We are a global network, you know, and I think that's something that I find really sort of fascinating and important.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, I agree. I feel like it's the passion that I've come across, these people that have really driven this whole, you know, this whole network and the initiative, not only the OWCN, but the more global perspective forward. There's just the passion just always strikes me. It's just so invigorating and inspiring. So thank you. I don't see any questions. Does anyone have any questions? Or Scott, Deneen, Mike, anyone? It looks like we still have about 40 people on. Any questions, comments?
I have a quick question I'll throw out there. One that's kind of embedded in my brain. So for Paul and or Mike, kind of in response to GOWRS, I think what has been going on with that project is I'm just so excited to watch it progress and really excited to see a potential project or service aspect of the assessment team come out of it. But how have you guys talked about as far as the challenge of, even with the service established with some funding and some process in place, still having issues with political approval to get to sites that you may think from the outside may need help, but maybe they don't think they need help? So more on the politics side, if there's anything discussion around that.
So yeah, I'll jump in and then Mike can add as well. I mean, I think this is one of the, well, you know, I would say there's a benefit there in terms of integrating it within the industry's response systems. You know, the fact that OSPA Response Limited has more of a global footprint. You know, we have a team that really know and are constantly working sort of challenges around visa and entry requirements. So the fact that in a way that team is almost provided cover through not just our infrastructure, but also, you know, our relationship with our members, you know, who are, you know, potentially going to be that responsible party in that instance. So I think that in itself is really helpful. I think the other part of it is, you know, it's really important that the GOWRS assessment team also becomes this catalyst for improving in-country preparedness efforts, that it's not just seen, the term has often been used as the red button. It's not the thing that's going to solve everything. So, you know, the more that we can test it in exercises and the more that within certain countries they can use that as a way of actually furthering their own preparedness, then ultimately I think it's going to be more effective. Yeah, within the sort of COVID context, certainly that international travel piece is a factor that definitely has to be borne in mind. But yeah, Mike, I don't know if you want to add to that with anything.
Yeah, it's a great question, and Paul touched on the key parts. As far as in the background on the GOWRS system, we do have what we call our pillars of response. And one of those pillars is making sure that the invitation is there and there's the ability to legally do the good work. I mean, those are key things. And we want to make sure that if the invitation is there and we can go there to assist, that it's not just for show, right? We want to make sure that we actually have the ability to go in and implement recommendations on behalf of the client to be able to do the work that would be necessary to care for these animals. And so it is a bit complex. OSRL is much better situated to be able to work through a lot of those things. But it's absolutely crucial to making sure we can do good work.
Okay, thank you. So it looks like we do have a question. This is for Paul. So it says, Paul, we've always talked about marine response. Did you see much activity in the organizations regarding other types of transportation of oil, trucks, pipelines, etc.?
I mean, it was certainly mentioned as one of the future challenges, you know, just the sort of the different beast, as it were, of these different kinds of responses, you know, whether it's the terrain, the species, the sort of cultural context of working with very different stakeholders. And I think when you're talking about some of those examples, again, I think it speaks to, you know, possibly getting called out, you know, very often, but sometimes for relatively small incidents. And I guess that brings its own challenges where, if, you know, you still might have that large scale marine incident and need those sort of trained and experienced people for that. But, you know, if the large extent of response is these sort of, you know, very different types of incidents, then, you know, how to bring all of that together. So yeah, I think that it was recognized that there's more work needed there, and really just thinking about how transportation is likely to change and what the impacts of that will be. So yeah, it's an interesting one to watch, and for you guys, I guess, to keep thinking about how does your preparedness sort of evolve to meet that challenge.
Definitely. Okay, any more questions? Final call. So we're at 10:05, 5 minutes past the hour. Looks like one more just came in. Is GOWRS involved in Peruvian oil disaster resulting from the Pacific eruption? Mike, do you want to take this one?
Sure. Excellent question. GOWRS directly is not. However, one of the 10 organizations, IUCA, is on the ground leading in partnership with a local organization, and they have the assistance from International Bird Rescue because they have a tier 3 partnership between the two. So the two of them are actually on the ground doing the work. They are keeping the GOWRS partners involved, and I do know OSRL also has individuals there on scene as well, including one of the key people that's been involved in the GOWRS discussions as well. So while GOWRS itself has not been activated, we're definitely in the loop and prepared to provide assistance if needed. Anything to add to that, Paul?
I think only it's worth reiterating. I think you touched on it, Mike, but GOWRS is not a live service yet. So we're still working through the sort of contracting and sort of readiness onboarding of the service. So I think that's sort of important to note. But obviously also, yeah, there are these more local relationships that organizations had and have, and certainly there's no need to sort of supersede those if those are in place. I think in this instance, you can recall quite quickly from Brazil to respond, and that's great. And as Mike said, I think the rest of the network is there if needed. Yeah, ultimately over time it might be that that GOWRS mechanism through OSRL is a mechanism that would be really helpful, especially in these instances where it's maybe difficult to get people into country.
Yeah, and that's key, is thinking about GOWRS as that final safety net to be able to protect things. If there's tier 1 and tier 2 capabilities there, those are absolutely what should be used, and we encourage clients to use them because they're going to have much more local capabilities and capacities. And only if that is not there, that's where the GOWRS system comes into play.
Okay, thank you. Did I miss anything that came through the chat, Scott?
Nope, I don't believe so. We have a couple comments just thanking folks for the great overview, but no additional questions that I see.
Okay, great. So I think we're going to wrap this up, but I do want to thank both Paul and Mike. Paul, thank you so much. Your interviews and pulling it all together was really amazing. And I'm sorry that we couldn't meet at Oilapalooza, but I'm so glad that you got the chance to present today. So thank you so much for that. And thank you, Mike, for your GOWRS overview. And I want to thank everyone that joined us today. And I'm going to hand it back over to Deneen. Final words.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, Paul. Thank you, Mike. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We look forward to another lecture in March. And again, that one is, make sure I have my dates correct, Wednesday, March 9th at noon Pacific time. So please consult the schedule that we sent out, and the link is there to register. And thank you again, everybody. It was great to have you all here today. And again, thank you, Mike and Paul.
Welcome. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye.